Okay, we've finally come to the last section of chapter 13. This is going to be quite a long video because I'm just going to complete the whole portion on reflex action in a single video. Alright, please ensure that you understand this really carefully. Make sure that you have got a textbook and your notes with you, and by the end of this video you should be able to complete the whole set of notes on chapter 13. Okay, now in this section you will be able to describe the roles of the spinal cord and the brain in a reflex action. You need to know what a reflex arc is and how it is different from the previous nervous transmission that I've taught you. You are supposed to also be able to distinguish between a cranial reflex and a spinal reflex. Okay, you should have a small hint on what the differences are because you have learned what cranial nerves are and what spinal nerves are. Okay, so just to help you recall, cranial nerves are nerves that come out from the brain anywhere above your neck. Spinal nerves are the nerves that branch out from anywhere below your neck. Right, so when it comes to a reflex, there are certain differences associated with that as well, which we are going to see in greater detail. Okay, so what is a reflex action, right? So a reflex action is an immediate response to a specific stimulus without any conscious control. Alright, so in other words, you can't decide whether or not you want to respond to it. Your body just responds automatically. Okay, so these actions are involuntary and they are not under a person's conscious control. The person cannot decide to ignore the stimulus. Okay, and the reflex arc actually takes the shortest pathway from the receptor to the effector. In other words, it bypasses the brain. Your brain does not need to process it and decide whether or not to respond. Your brain does not play a part in the reflex arc. Okay, I want to highlight here, I hope you hear me clearly, that not all involuntary actions are reflex actions. There are some involuntary actions such as breathing and your heart beating that are not reflex actions, but they are involuntary. In other words, you can't control whether or not your heart should beat. You can't will your heart to stop beating. Okay, your heart has to keep beating and it will continue to do so, and is therefore an involuntary action, but it is not a reflex action. Okay, however, all reflex actions are involuntary. So you can safely say that reflex actions are a subset of all involuntary actions. Alright. So I'll show you a video on reflex actions on SLS for you to understand better what it really is. Okay, so an example of a reflex action, right? Everything seems fluffy now, so I'm just going to give you a very concrete example. So a reflex action is something like this. Imagine you touch a hot frying pan accidentally. Alright, all of us will know that if you have accidentally touched something really hot, your hand jerks away immediately. You take away your hand immediately, even without your brain telling you to do so. You don't leave your hand there and then your brain decides, oh, should I take my hands away, right? Your body reacts way faster than that. Okay, so how does it work, right? So the first step when your fingers comes into contact with a hot pan or hot frying pan or hot kettle, the heat actually stimulates the thermoreceptors in your skin. And therefore the thermoreceptors in your skin will be known as the receptor in this case. Right, the nerve impulses are produced and they are transmitted along the sensory neuron towards the central nervous system. In this case is where the spinal cord is. Okay, and in the spinal cord, nerve impulses are transmitted to the relay neuron, which is what you have learned earlier, and the nerve impulse transmission. Okay, so the relay neuron then relays the nerve impulse to the motor neuron. Okay, At the same time, nerve impulses are transmitted to the brain, but you need to take note that the brain has no part to play in the reflex arc. Okay, the brain does not decide whether or not to carry out the action. Okay, immediately nerve impulses are transmitted towards the motor neuron, okay, and straight away to the effector. And the effector in this case will be your arm muscles that causes the withdrawal of your hand from the hot object. Okay, so the fact that nerve impulses go to the brain only allows your brain to know that, oh, you know, this is happening, but your brain does not play an active role in the reflex reaction. Okay? Okay, I need you to pause the video here and read your textbook and complete your notes. If you need more time to process everything I've just said, you may even need to repeat whatever I've said just to strengthen your understanding and clarify your certain concepts. Okay, and then we'll move on to the types of reflex actions. So there are two main types of reflex actions. First, it will be the spinal reflex, which is what you see earlier. So this is an example of a spinal reflex because nerve impulses are transmitted to the spinal cord. Okay, the second type of reflex will be the cranial reflex. Alright, but before I go there, let me just give you some examples, more examples of what spinal reflexes are. So earlier on, what you saw with the example of the hot frying pan will be an example, would be a withdrawal reflex. Alright, there's this other reflex known as a knee-jerk reflex. Please feel free to go and Google YouTube videos on knee-jerk reflexes, and then you can even try it yourself with your sibling or your friend. So your knee-jerk reflex essentially means that if you let your leg hang on a high chair or if you sit on the table and let your leg hang, alright, if you use a hammer, okay, to just slightly tap a certain part of your knee will jerk without you being able to control it. So no matter how hard you try to stop your knee from jerking, just by lightly hammering that portion of your knee, it will cause your knee to jerk. Alright, and that's known as a knee-jerk reflex. So you can feel free to watch some videos on it. It's quite interesting and you can try it yourself. Alright, so I'll move on to cranial reflex. So cranial reflex are reflexes that are controlled by the brain, but they occur without a person's consciousness. An example would be the pupil reflex. So imagine I'm throwing a big ball straight at your face. Okay, immediately you will blink to prevent. It's just defense mechanism. It's just something that your body does automatically, so you can't control it. Alright, another one is salivation. So when you're hungry and you smell something really nice, you will naturally produce more saliva and you cannot stop that from happening. Okay, and because these two things, your eye and your salivary glands all occur above the neck, they are known as cranial reflexes. Okay, so this is an example of the knee-jerk reflex that I was telling you about. So if you hit the tendon under your kneecap, you just need to tap it lightly. Okay, nerve impulses will be sent via the sensory neuron towards the central nervous system, which is in this case the spinal cord. Information is passed from the sensory neuron to the relay neuron, then to the motor neuron, and your leg muscle will contract, causing the lower leg to jerk. Okay? When school reopens, we may be able to try it with some of you. Okay, here is an example of a cranial reflex. For example, if you go from a very dark room to stare straight at the sun in a bright environment, it will cause your pupil to constrict. Okay, dim light will cause your pupils to dilate, right, to increase the amount of light entering entering the eye. This will be covered in greater detail by Miss Lake in chapter 14, okay, on the pupil reflex. So I reiterate, the reflex arc is the shortest pathway which nerve impulses travel from the receptor to the effector in a reflex action. This is the definition that you must remember. Alright, and how do you explain a reflex arc? These components will all need to be present. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These components will need to be present. Depending on the example that we give you, it may be in the form of an essay question. You apply it accordingly. Okay, and that's all for this part on reflex action.